we are now, back in the 1800s and the 1830s, this would have been the location of the Smith and Whipper lumber yard. And it was actually owned by African Americans. And Columbia has a really, really interesting history with the Underground Railroad. They had some very rich African Americans that lived here and helped a lot of slaves from the South come over. They come up through York County, come across the river, and come to Columbia. And it was a very important place on the Underground Railroad. So a lot of the history we'll be talking about is related to the Underground Railroad. They had 29 rail cars in their lumber yard, and they would hide slaves in the walls of those rail cars and transport them and so forth. We can start our walk. We're going to be going up and following the river trail. So if you follow me, we'll head on our way. If you have any questions or anything along the way, just let me know. Oh, if you want to throw apples out for the Albatwitches when we get up to the park, grab an apple. So this building right here was the original Columbia train depot. This was the home of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Right here, this home was in Columbia. This was the building. And as we go up here, right around here, this would have been the location of Keebler, the original Keebler bakery. Right here. He had a partner, I don't remember his name, but it was Keebler and this partner. And he went from here, he moved to New Jersey and started what became the Keebler company you know today. But his original business, his original bakery was right here. So at the bridge we're about to cross under, in 1930, 6 men died making that bridge. They're all entombed in the concrete. They fell in, they couldn't fish them out. So there are 6 men, 6 bodies in this bridge, entombed. So up here you can see Bootleg Antiques. That is one of the more haunted places in Columbia. They have activity there day and night. They've actually got film of stuff like flying off the shelf behind people and so forth. I don't know that there are any specific stories with it, but there is haunting phenomenon that happens with great frequency in Bootleg Antiques. They may or may not have had actual bootleggers in there. There's some question. But if you ask them, they did.
What was it originally there?
It was a washing machine company. But they said that they think there was maybe bootleggers in there too. So that's the name. All right, we are going to go across and then across the street. This is the last time we have to cross the road. So carefully, please. All right. So this would have been around the location. There was a railroad roundhouse here, and in the 1900s, a man had brought sheep up that got sick, and he dumped them in the Susquehanna River. Yeah. They had Asiatic cholera, and they got stuck in the water pipe that they used to feed the water into the town. So it was a cholera outbreak. 110 people died, and they said there was so many people were dying here that they were finding them just laying on the docks of the roundhouse and stuff. So they mostly immigrants. They said they would find just laying out dead. They don't know if somebody just dragged their bodies there, or if they, ended up dying there. So it's 110 people. Columbia, speaking of disease, Columbia has the honor of being the first place in the United States that ever had smallpox. It was right here in Columbia. So go Columbia.
Go Columbia.
It's very dark out here.
So, going to be talking about this fence right here. And you saw me shining my light as we were walking up over on the other side. That's what I've been looking for. That fence actually fences in an entrance to an underground tunnel system. And that tunnel system goes under the entire city of Colombia. And that was used for the Underground Railroad.
Wow.
They would bring, there was a black settlement right on the side of the river. They're very smart about the way they did this. Because they would bring slaves up through York, across the river, and, sorry, I don't mean to blind you. They bring slaves up through York across the river, and they get them into that that black settlement rather, and they just blend in. And a lot of times they dress men as women, they do all kinds of stuff on the other side in order to hide them and get them over here. But once they got them over here, this is pre-photography, they didn't have pictures of these guys. These slave catchers would come up and they'd look for them and they couldn't find them because they just blend into that black community. That was a white man who was a Quaker. He was very anti-slavery. He lived on the other side of the river in Wrightsville. Actually, William Wright, I believe. He established that community. He helped them establish that community, and that was its entire purpose. They would get there, they would blend in, they would get in these tunnels, they'd get under these tunnels. There's a whole network under Colombia. They would go to different hotels and different black-owned businesses, and they'd get these slaves in and out of here, and eventually up to Canada is where they were going with them. So it's really, really interesting history with Colombia and the Underground Railroad. There is spooky stuff and ghost stuff coming, but while we're here, do the history.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So we're about to enter, we're going to cross under the Route 30 bridge. It's going to be a little bit loud. So, same what I was going to say there. When we cross that bridge, we're going to enter, which is Chickies Park. And some people claim it's the most haunted place in Pennsylvania. I think Gettysburg would probably argue that. But there's a lot of tales with Chickies Park. And we try to wonder, we're like, why are there all these different tales? Because there's all this variety of strange things. It's not all this Albatwitch creature, it's not all ghosts. It's a lot of different strange things. And one thing I've been looking into, if you listen to my podcast, is the relation of iron furnaces to supernatural activity, which in Pennsylvania at least, there seems to be some sort of correlation between Columbia and Marietta, which is the town right on the other side of Chickies Hill. So we're walking into Chickies Park now. It's just right on the other side of the park. There were 7 iron furnaces at one time in operation. Iron was the major industry. So they're all abandoned now. Does that have something to do with it? I don't know. The other tale was there was a witch, supposedly, who lived on Chiques Rock, or around Chiques Rock, and when they took the land and they made her move, supposedly she put a curse on the area, and supposedly that's the reason for all the spooky stuff. Now, there's some question as to whether she was what was known as the River Witch, who lived in Marietta. Now, the River Witch, her name was most popularly Nellie Knoll. You find it in books, but her real name was Emma Knapp. And I have found her using aliases as Emma Knoll and one other alias as well. She was a cut wife. She gave abortions. She was arrested for giving abortions in 1882, I believe, and counterfeiting. She was counterfeiting. And later in her life, she was the one, if you're familiar with the Hex murder in York County, where 3 fellows went down to southern York County and they killed a man they believed had put a hex on them. She was involved in that, and the one fellow came over and he was trying to figure out who put a hex on him, and supposedly he had come to her several times and she was his teacher. She taught him about the occult and so forth, supposedly. And he came over and she said, "Hand me $1. So the story goes, he handed her $1. She folded it up, handed it back to him. He unfolded it and saw the face of the man who cursed him, and that was Nelson Raymeyer, and that's the man he eventually, with 2 other guys, ended up killing in Raymeyer's Hollow in York County. So she was involved in that case and had some infamy associated with her. She ran with the rough crowd. Her husband actually worked at one of those. He was an enameler at one of the ironworks in Marietta. Before that, she lived with one of the people who were related to the Shanks Tavern in Marietta, which is a haunted tavern now if you go to Marietta. And she actually lived about 2 doors down from that. and that was a rough part of town in Marietta back in the turn of the century. That was a rough area. So she and her husband died and are buried in Marietta Cemetery. We've as yet to locate their grave because the records from Marietta Cemetery, I can't find out who has them. But we know from her death certificate she died and was buried in Marietta Cemetery. So was it the River Witch who put a curse on the whole land that's caused all this weirdness? Who can say?
I'm not blinding you, am I?
No, no, no. We're going to cross under Route 30 and then we'll talk some more. It's going to be too loud under there to talk. So this is the ruins of one of those 7 iron furnaces that were from between Marietta and Columbia. They're pretty impressive structures. They burn charcoal in there, and they keep it burning for weeks and months at a time. And they would have a bridge going to the top of it where they would just dump iron ore in. And it would they just keep it in there and keep it heating, and it would just run out the bottom. And sometimes they'd have molds they put at the bottom, the iron would run into. Sometimes they just run it out and get raw iron bars and stuff. But none of these trees would have been here at that time. It was very, very hard on the environment. It killed everything around it.
How long has it been abandoned?
They stopped running the iron industry early 1900s, like very early. I want to say like 1911 or something was probably the last time they would run it. Now, since we're running up by the Susquehanna, we talk about some of the creatures they found in the Susquehanna. North of here, they actually found an alligator, and this is a true story. Someone had a pet, someone owned a bar, and he thought it'd be a good idea to have a pet alligator, and it got too big, so he let it go in the Susquehanna. But it lived for years afterwards. You're not supposed to live, it's a tropical animal, but it did. It made it. Somehow, they think it got down in the mud or something. And it was a huge alligator. They said it was like 500 pounds, a massive alligator. They didn't know what it was. The locals, they kept saying this monster was coming up out of the Susquehanna. It was eating sheep. It was coming up on shore, grabbing sheep, taking them down and eating them. And they finally caught it and killed it. A bunch of guys got it. They were drunk one night, went out in rafts and found the thing and killed it. And they had a guy come down from a university in New York, and he actually stuffed it. He said it's one of the biggest alligators he'd ever seen, but it was in the Susquehanna. I'm trying to locate that. It must be somewhere, because this is early 1900s that he came down and had that thing taxidermied. So that alligator must be somewhere. But that was a little bit north of here. Across the river is Hellam, and that's an area that I focus on a lot. There were very, very strange creatures that came out of the water in the area of Hellam. A woman called me a couple years ago. I was working on a book on the area of Toad Road, which is right over there across the river. And she said, "Do you know about the Toad Man?" Now there's a rumor that it was a guy who collected toad statues that lived on the road and would chase people around. And that's what I thought she meant, but something about the way she said it made me think, like, I said, "What do you mean Toad Man?" And she said, "No, what it sounds like. It's a toad creature that comes out of the Cadorus Creek, which feeds into the Susquehanna right there, right at Toad Road." And she said it's like a man that looks like a toad. It's green. And she said it was very, very horrible and she said, "I don't want to tell you that I saw it, but I can't tell you I didn't see it." She said, "But that was what we were all afraid of. We were all afraid of the Toad Man." And she said that's what Toad Road was named for. I don't believe that's the case. It was a tow road for the canal, I believe, and it got misnomered to Toad Road later in its life. But in any case, I thought, wow, that's a strange story. Now there are toad men in folklore all over the world, so it's not completely crazy, but hadn't heard it around here. And then I unearthed a newspaper article from 1907 from about 8 miles north of there, where people said they saw what they called a fish man walk out of the Susquehanna River and onto the shore in broad daylight. So we have something like a fish man or a toad man that lives in the water. There have been Bigfoot sightings, several in the area. In 1900, a Columbia school teacher was walking to school, and she was scared by what they called them wild men back then. She was scared to death by a wild man. She couldn't teach that day. Very, very frightened. In 1912 in Marietta, next town up, there was a wild man prowling in the area, and 2 beagles were killed. They found them just torn apart, ripped apart, and they blamed that on the wild man. In 1913, right across the river from here is a place called the Accomack. It's supposed to be a haunted inn. It's been there for a long, long time. But in 1913, there was a wild man that had chased the owner's daughter along the shore of the Susquehanna and frightened her. They say he was a naked, hairy wild man right over there in York County. In 1984, Laurel Hill Cemetery, which is up at the top of Chiques Rock across the way, there was a couple spotted a creature. They said it was 6 feet tall and was lumbering towards them, scared them out of the graveyard, and they actually closed the graveyard for Chris says he remembers it being closed for maybe up to a week. They didn't let people up there. Oh. And in 2014, Chickies Creek, which runs into the Susquehanna just on the other side of Chiques Rock, there was a guy who was fishing in a boat, and he said he heard something above him in the area of Chiques Rock, and it was let out a scream and threw a big rock down at him. But he never saw it, but he assumed it was a Bigfoot from the way it acted. All right, we'll go up a little further. We're working our way towards the tunnel. All right. I'm all right. Chad? Oh, he's back there. He's way back there. So this is the train tunnel, obviously. Maybe not obviously. You can still see the marks where they dynamited it. They drill in and drop the dynamite in and blow the rock out. Now this would have been, Chiques Rock is right up that way. So this is sort of I call it the folkloric home of the Albatwitch, because we get more sightings from other places than we do for actually Chiques Rock. But Chiques Rock is kind of known as the home of the Albatwitches. So they call it it gets associated with Chiques Rock. It's a fairly populated county park at this point. So if it's a natural creature, which we could debate whether it is or isn't, I don't believe it is, but if it acts in any way like a natural creature, it's not going to live in here, I don't think. That's not to say that people don't find footprints and stuff. Occasionally they do, but I call it the folkloric home of the Albatwitch. That is, if you don't know, it's our little hairy creature, and it's like a Bigfoot, but it's never seen with adults, so we assume that it is not a juvenile. It has a different build. They tend to be thinner, very slight in build, and a lot of the reports have it with orange or yellow glowing eyes, which isn't too different than Bigfoot. Bigfoot seems to have rainbow glowing eyes. Any color will do with Bigfoot, but they get reported, and since we've done the festival, we get a lot of people contact us and said, "Oh, I saw that. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know it had a name. I saw it. I just thought it was a teenage Bigfoot or something. I didn't know what it was." And so we've gotten a lot more reports. We've probably doubled the number of reports we had before we started the festival, which is very rare. In my first book, I document all kinds of strangeness, all kinds of cryptids and stuff in York and Adams and Lancaster County. And I have, I want to say, between 50 and 100 Bigfoot reports in there, and I think at that time I had maybe 3 to 5 Albatwitch reports. So if you think how rare a Bigfoot sighting is, the Albatwitch sighting would be that much rarer. But they are associated with this area, they're associated with the river. You know, we don't know what they are, but we've had sightings as far west as Red Line in York County. I've tracked sightings in old folklore books from Maryland, just south of here along the river. And they called them Puckamawedgies, which is the name they use up north for what seems to be the same thing. They call them Puckwedgies up there. In the Maryland book, they call them Puckamawedgies. So that's our little creature, and that's why we started the festival, to do that. But Chiques Rock is a very special place. It's a very strange place, and there's some stories, both supernatural and otherwise, that are associated with it. And one of my favorites is just a very normal story about gypsies that were living on Chickies Rock. And this comes from the Harrisburg Telegraph from September 1st, 1899. On Chiques Rock, a beautiful spot overlooking the Susquehanna River near Marietta, a band of 400 gypsies has been encamped for the past 6 weeks. And yesterday, a crowd of 1,000 spectators saw them crown a queen of the tribe. For the past 25 years, Queen Mary Buckland has ruled the gypsies to their entire satisfaction. It is the tribe's prerogative to dethrone a queen who may have incurred their displeasure. But Queen Mary today resigned voluntarily, and her beautiful daughter, Devora, assumed the crown. The day marked a double celebration, it being the latter's 25th birthday anniversary, and in honor of the event, the gypsies were attired in their most gaudy costumes. In a grove, a rustic throne was erected. It was covered with dazzling bunting and decorated with wildflowers and flags, in the center of which was a similarly adorned chair with a rug and footstool. Devora was led from her tent to the throne on the arm of William Brown, a young member of the tribe, who was attired in a bright red suit. The queen-to-be was tastefully dressed in black silk. The other members of the tribe grouped themselves about the throne, and Brown addressed the audience, announcing the new queen had been duly elected by a majority vote of the tribe. Then Mrs. Anna Smith, upon whom the honor had previously been conferred, placed the crown of black jetting and silk and containing an inscription in the gypsy language upon Devora's head. Each member of the tribe stepped forward and pledged the queen their devotion and support. This was followed by a gypsy musicale. Devora, like her mother, was born in Belmont Castle in northern Egypt. At an early age, she moved to England, where she was reared. Edward Smith, her grandfather, who was 87 years old, prides himself that his family has not slept one night sheltered in a house for 7 generations. I have to stop reading for a second. The allergies are getting my eyes. Reading the phone. So another strange newspaper article, which I'm not going to read because my eyes are not cooperating at the moment, is there was a woman from Ohio who came here to visit, and she was last seen walking along the Susquehanna River around Chiques Rock, they said, and they found her hat and her gloves with a note that said, "Goodbye." And that's all they found. They assumed she committed suicide in the Susquehanna River, but they're not sure. This tunnel here has a great story associated with it. It's one of the, a man named Michael Keebler in the 1800s. He was working at one of the iron furnaces north of here. And there was a law, it's actually a state law in Pennsylvania, in the 1700s this law was established. Iron furnace work was so dangerous that they wouldn't allow alcohol to be sold within 2 miles of an iron furnace. But he wanted some whiskey, and he was working at that furnace. And the quickest way from those furnaces to Columbia, where he could get a drink, was through this tunnel. So he mounted up his wagon and horse, and he headed this way, and a train came while he's in the middle of the tunnel and tore him to pieces. Now he is supposed to haunt this tunnel. The rangers actually said they think it's him because they said they'll come through here, they'll drive through here, there's nothing sharp, there's no reason for them to have a tire puncture. And they get flat tires in here all the time, and they'll hear someone speaking while they're in here. And they always associate it with that Michael Keebler. One of the railroad workers later who worked here said he would always see men come out of the tunnel and then just disappear. He thought they were other workers or other train workers and stuff. They would come out of the tunnel and he'd look for them and they'd just be gone. So there are specific ghost stories associated with this tunnel. And we are going to make our way back. I have a few more stories on the way.
So Tim,
Yeah.
this was blank almost the whole way up here until we got to the tunnel.
Wow, look at that.
It's halfway up.
Wow.
Most of the walk here, totally dark. And I don't see any wires in here.
Yeah, there shouldn't. You can throw your apples in the woods at any point. The Albatwitch is supposed to be all around, so they will presumably pick them up. We're not done. There's more stories. Not to head back. That's all the clearance we have. Yeah. So I guess I could have done this in the tunnel, but Chiques Rock has so many strange stories associated with it. There was a woman in the 1940s who saw, she was there in a work picnic with her workmates, and two of them saw what they described as a 13-foot tall, very, very skinny entity that was wrapped like a mummy and had knives sticking out of its head. And it terrified them, and they ran out and they went to some of the men that worked at the company, and they said, you know, that's silly. And they went back and they saw it, and they came back scared, and they, you know, never saw what it was, never figured out what it was. Years later, in the 1960s, they were having what was called ghost mania on Chiques Rock. People were coming there all the time. The police actually had to just sit up there and patrol because people were coming in to see all the different ghosts, and a lot of things were seen. They said a silver sort of sentient mist was seen. It seemed like it had some sort of sentience to it. It moved around, and strange lights and so forth. But one of the things that someone saw, now this is, you know, 29 years later or something after this woman saw what she described as the mummy, someone said they saw something very tall and very thin that had its head wrapped in bandages, and it said it had knives sticking out of its head. So this is someone who, years later, he had no, you know, we didn't have ghost story books back then. He had no knowledge of this woman's story, and he saw the same thing 29 years later. We don't know what that was. People have heard drumming here. They've come here very early in the morning, and they've heard drumming, what they assume to be Indian drumming, and going to look for it and found nothing. One of the strangest things that people have seen, they were on Chickies Rock early in the morning, and they saw lights coming down the Susquehanna. Big globes of light just floating down the river. They turned and they went into Chickies Rock. They went into the face of the rock, and they said they walked up and they touched it after the lights went in, and they could feel it vibrating. So there's UFO activity as well associated with that. Walk a little bit more, and we get a little bit closer to the bridge. I will tell a story about the murder of the Accomack from across the way. I can't see, so. So across the river is the Accomack, which I talked about before with the Wild Man story. It's a very, very old inn, and there's lots of ghost stories associated with it. But one of the more interesting stories has to do with John Coyle, who fell in love. His parents were running the Accomack at the time, and he fell in love with a woman who worked there, a young lady named Emma. And I'll tell you her last name one second. Emma Myers. And she did not return his affections, and he shot her through the heart with a revolver. And he was arrested, of course, and they took him to trial in York. It was a very, very quick trial. They found him guilty, but it was so quick that they declared it a mistrial. They said he didn't get a fair trial. So he had to change the venue, and he was moved to Gettysburg. And there, at one of the public hearings for the trial, Emma Myers' aunt brought her heart in a jar to show everyone that had the hole blown in it from the revolver. So she had her heart. Emma Myers is buried in Marietta. The Coyles ran a ferry from Marietta over to the Accomack, as well as running the Accomack. Well, John Coyle's hanged eventually. They found him guilty. There was no question of his guilt. but he had acquired some fame when he was in jail, and he had some friends and people that were writing him letters, and he had made some money somehow when he was in jail, and either bought or was gifted a very expensive pocket watch. And people knew this because he bragged about it in the newspaper articles. So when they brought his body back, people were very interested in A, in seeing this body of this famous murderer, and B, seeing what he was buried with, because maybe he had that pocket watch. Well, they took his body over to Marietta Cemetery, and the cemetery said, no, 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 not in here. And he got turned away. They took him back across the river, back to the Accomack, where he's buried now. There's a tombstone by the Accomack. His gravestone's right there. And I forget the actual epitaph. It says something like, "Mother, don't weep for me, I'm only sleeping." But it's still there. You can see it next to the Accomack. His father slept on his grave for 3 nights. They said he was so worried about grave robbers coming to dig him up. He slept on his son's grave for 3 nights. And it is supposed to be his ghost and Emma Meyer's ghost which haunt the grounds of the Accomack to this day. So it's a very neat story that connects both Marietta, both this side of the river and the York County side. So I believe I'm out of stories, but we can walk back if you want to talk or ask any questions or anything. I'm here, and we'll head back to Columbia. I might remember some more on the way. So before we leave Albatwitch land, I figure I'd do a not so humble brag and tell everybody about the name Albatwitch and who discovered, not discovered, but rediscovered its true meaning. A lot of times around here they said it came from apples, because the creatures supposedly were throwing apples at people and stealing people's apples, and they came from apple snitch, and that just never seemed right to me. It just didn't seem right. So with the help of a German-speaking friend, I looked at the name, and Alb is German for elf. It's a little thing like an elf, and there's a German verb which Jerry could probably pronounce much better than me.
It's elf. You've got me on the spot. Alpha switch.
Okay.
Alpha switch.
Which means to escape in a sort of
ghostly manner.
Gliding, ghostly manner. And we think that the combination of those two words, German words, gave us the anglicized Albatwitch. Now the creatures were here before the Germans showed up. The Susquehannocks had them painted on their shield, what they called devils at the time, but they were little hairy things. So they were here, and the actual, if you trace Albatwitch back to Germany, it described a completely different animal. It was some weird little bird-like thing. It was like a bird with hands. It's another folkloric mystery creature, but it was not a little ape man like it is here. And we think probably what happened was when the Germans moved here and they started seeing these strange things, they didn't have, I don't know, it's an Albatwitch. They just had a name for another strange thing in Germany, and they just applied it to the Albatwitch. So that is the name. It comes from the Germans that moved here. We do not know the original Native American name for those creatures. Pukwudgie, like I said, that's an imported Native American term. It's not even from, it comes from a Midwestern tribe. It was their name for the little ones, but somehow it got moved to eastward from that. So we do not know what the First Nations people called the Albatwitches in the area, but the German immigrants, that's their name for them, the Albatwitch. So, and we will proceed.